See Robert Black here also from around the corner. Nice to see you, Robert. I caught a glimpse of Lionel Shepson here also on the screen for a moment. We've got, Baruch Hashem, quite a few familiar faces here and a few new faces, and it's wonderful to see everybody. We're looking at major themes from Sefer Bereishit. I'm trying to choose the themes in a way which make them a little bit relevant to our way of thinking and to our lives. And of course, Sefer Bereishit isn't just telling us history, it's telling us the origins of mankind and the origins of human nature and the challenges which are built in to human nature and the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created us. And just to give you a brief background of what we looked at in the last two shiurim, one of the most powerful themes that we looked at from Parshas Bereishit was the idea of the Tzelem Elokim, which means the spiritual dimension of human life, that every person is endowed with a Tzelem Elokim, what has come to be known following more the Balei Kabbalah. We usually refer to it as the neshama, but in the Torah it never uses the word neshama. The word neshama doesn't appear in the Chumash, instead of which it uses the word Tzelem Elokim, a divine, in some way, a divine image, a divine spirit. What exactly is the nature of that Tzelem Elokim? We have looked at a little bit. Different Mefarshim see it from a slightly different angle, right? The Meshech Chochmah speaks about the Tzelem Elokim as being a person's ability to have free choice, that nothing else in nature has a free choice. Everything else is guided either by the laws of nature, right? The planets and biology and physics have no choice. They're all guided by very strict laws of nature, or the animal kingdom are guided by instinct, an animal instinct. They don't have freedom of choice, which relates to the ability to differentiate between right and wrong, with a value system and with more of a spiritual understanding of the purpose of creation. We discussed a little bit the idea of the origins of the universe and the age of the origins of the universe. And I remember George brought us certain aspects from physics and chemistry. We had a healthy debate about how many scientists are out there who are God-fearing and how many are atheists. And I leave that to you, George, to make a survey among your colleague scientists. But what I'd like to have a look at is maybe a less well-known aspect of the Tzelem Elokim, and that is, in many ways, that the Chumash, while on the one hand speaking to us about the spiritual nature of mankind, and thereby giving the human being, I'd just like to mention this, giving the human being a status which is radically, qualitatively, totally different from the animal kingdom. One of the important points being made, which of course is challenged in various different parts of human culture, right? That the human being is actually not a member of the animal kingdom, right? That in actual fact, animals and human beings, while we have quite a fair amount in common in terms of biology and the nature of eating, sleeping, procreating, etc., we have certain animal side to us. The essence of the human being is something spiritual, right? And sometimes I get it. I'm sure many of you have had the experience to have in your house guests who are vegetarians or vegans. And I hope I'm not offending any vegetarians or vegans who are present at the Shia, but there's nothing wrong with vegetarianism or veganism if it's taken on the basis that you feel that either it's more healthy or you like it better, or maybe you feel that animals are not properly treated by the way they're farmed, or one thing and another. All that's perfectly acceptable. That's all questions of personal preference. But some vegetarians and vegans come from a point of view which is clearly in conflict with the Torah. The concept between some of the vegetarians and vegans is we are animals. We're part of the animal kingdom. And we should not be consuming our fellow animals any more than we would consume fellow human beings. And that is exactly a boundary which the Torah makes. The Torah makes a qualitative boundary between the animal kingdom and the human world that we are not actually occupying the same place at all in terms of our value system, right? So there are valid reasons for being a vegan or vegetarian, and there are clearly invalid reasons, right? It's also true, for example, in some of the Hindu and other Eastern religions, that they don't differentiate between the human and the animal world. The animal world is sacred in the same way as the human world is, and they are vegetarians because they have not accepted the idea of the Tzelem Elokim, which places the human being in a separate category completely, and emphasizes the fact that human beings have a sanctity to them and an infinite value. Incidentally, in medical bioethics, of course, there's a lot spoken about the principle of the sanctity of life, the value of human life, which anyone who delves into any issues, as I have, connected to issues, say, for example, euthanasia, abortion, end-of-life issues, the whole concept of the sanctity of life is central to the understanding in the Western world of how we treat human beings differently to animals. And all that comes from the Tzelem Elokim. The Tzelem Elokim principle is a rock foundational principle. In fact, in one of the shiurim I gave a little while ago on the Rambam's 13 ikrim, 13 principles, I volunteered some of the principles that the Rambam left out. And I don't know why he left them out, but in my opinion, there are certain principles he should have added to the 13 principles. One of them was the principle of freedom of choice, the Bechira, which he himself calls a principle, an Ikka Godel. In Hilchos Tshuva, he calls Bechira an Ikka Godel, a major principle, but he doesn't include it in his 13 Ikrim. And the other one is the Tzelem Elokim, the existence of the sanctity of life, the sanctity of the human being is in fact axiomatic in the Torah and in the Jewish way of thinking, and it has been adopted in many ways by Western culture in the format of the sanctity of life and doing everything possible to save lives. Sadly, in certain parts of Europe and in the world, there is a sort of passive euthanasia concept among certain doctors and in certain hospitals, that if people come in and they're of a certain age and of a certain disposition, the hospital sadly takes the view, well, you know, they've had a good life, let them die with dignity. And they don't actually fight to save lives. I think everybody should be aware of this. If you, God forbid, send a very elderly person, anybody, I don't know, over 80 into a hospital. So here in Israel, they will fight for your life. Ad me'ad eshem, they'll fight for your life. In Europe, this is not the case. In Europe, very often, I've personally had occasion, I'll tell you a very brief anecdote here as a footnote, in my role as a Rav of a community, on several occasions, I've had like a frantic phone call from somebody in hospital. I've just taken my grandfather into hospital. He's 80 years old and he's got pneumonia. And the doctors say that's it. I should prepare myself for the worst. And I say, and I ask him, tell me, has he got any other system failures? Is his heart or the liver or kidneys, anything else failing? He said, no, he's got pneumonia. So I said to him, you go back to the doctor and you say to him, pneumonia we treat with antibiotics, and he should give him a strong antibiotic treatment and he'll be fine. And he says, really? Am I allowed to say that to a doctor? For some reason, doctors are put on a holy pedestal, even more than rabbis are. You'll be amazed to know that, right? Some people worship the word of a doctor, and that is Kodesh Kadoshim. The doctor says this is it, then that's it. This is not the case, incidentally. If a doctor says to you, this is the end, you've got to say to him, who are you to say this is the end? There's treatment. We've got to look for treatment. If it's really multi-system failures of various sorts, that's a different story. In actual fact, this fellow rang me up to ask me if he should alert the Chevra Kadisha to the fact that his grandfather was dying. And I said to him, you don't alert the Chevra Kadisha. You tell the doctor in no uncertain terms, give him strong antibiotics. And in actual fact, I remember this very clearly, about 2 or 3 years later, this young man in my community had a simcha, had a bris of a kid, and his grandfather was there. His grandfather came, and at the bris, the fellow said to me, "See this guy, my grandfather? That's the fellow we were talking about. He was then 80, he's now 83. They gave him antibiotics, and he's a bit weak, but he's doing fine." Why am I mentioning this? Because not every hospital and doctor has a deep understanding of the sanctity of life and the Tzelem Elokim, that every life has infinite value and every moment of every life has infinite value. And therefore, all the issues of end of life and suicide and euthanasia, etc., are considered a violation of the Tzelem Elokim principle. And that is really a foundational idea, which I touched on last week. I'd now like to proceed to a second, bit more complicated idea, which we find in the Torah, which is, it's true that the human being has a Tzelem Elokim, but the Torah gives us this idea that it is possible for a person to lose his Tzelem Elokim. In other words, the Tzelem Elokim is not hardwired into the human being. It is an option of a way to live. We have to treat every human being as if they are absolutely Tzelem Elokim with the sanctity of life. But for an individual vis-a-vis God, a person can lose his, if you like, his raison d'etre, can lose his purpose in life, and he can behave in such a way that the Tzelem Elokim has been in some way disconnected. One can disconnect one's Tzelem Elokim in a certain ways, and the Torah gives us various different accounts in which the Tzelem Elokim can be lost, right? In terms of Sefer Bereishit, these different accounts fall into four different categories. One was the Dor Enosh, which I think I spoke to you about, which is Avodah Zarah, which is paganism. The second is the Dor Hamabul, the generation of the flood, who also were, because of their uncontrolled lusts and desires, were also lost their Tzelem Elokim. The third we're going to look at a bit more today. It's a bit more complicated and not so clear in the Torah, which is the Migdal Bovel. The Tower of Babel was also a major error of mankind, which is documented in the Torah as a generation who lost their Tzelem Elokim, they lost their focus, and they lost their right to survive. What exactly they did wrong, we're going to look at in a few moments. And the fourth is this week's parsha, which is Sodom. Sodom also represents institutionalized selfishness, egoism, promiscuity, and a denial of chesed. Right? If Avraham Avinu represents the ultimate chesed, Sodom is the antithesis of Avraham Avinu, represents anti-chesed. Chazal tell us it was forbidden in Sodom. It was forbidden in Sodom to help out anybody in need. If somebody came to you and said, "I'm starving, hungry, I'm about to die," you were supposed to say to him, "Please die quietly over there and don't make a mess. We're not interested in whether you're living or dying. As far as we're concerned, shali, shali, v'shelcha, shelcha is midas Sodom. What I've got is mine, and I'm not sharing it with anybody. I'm not giving it to anybody. I'm not sharing it with anybody. It's mine. It'll always be mine." And that was the height of, if you like, anti-chesed. And even though there are individuals like that, Sodom was unique in the fact that they had institutionalized it. In other words, they had made a culture out of anti-chesed, right? And that's why when Noach in this week's parsha, when Lot in this week's parsha wants to give hospitality to the two malachim who come to visit him, the whole town is in uproar. What is this business about giving hospitality to visitors? We don't want visitors. And the visitors come, we let them die of starvation in the street. That was Sodom, and that was the fourth, if you like, type, the fourth way in which mankind lost their way. So in a sense, and this is for those of you who've ever read the Kuzarin, Yehuda Halevi has got a very beautiful narrative of this whole process, whereby the Tzelem Elokim was given to Adam and then given to Shais. As we saw last week, Shais was B'tzalmoi, and then after Shais, only really a handful of individuals, Chanoich, Mesushelach, Noach, Shem, and Ava, had that Tzelem Elokim. All the others lost it. All the others were lost in the spiritual confusion, which was really all part of these four different generations of spiritual disintegration. Interestingly, it's not Pesach now, but one of my Divrei Torah on Pesach is the Shaloh HaKadosh, one of the great Mekubalim of the 17th century, Rabbi Shaya Halevi Horowitz, who wrote a sefer called Shnei Luchos Abris. That's why it's called the Shaloh, Shin Lamed Hey. Also meant to be an acronym of Yeshaya Halevi Horowitz. But anyhow, he writes about the Haggadah a unique reason, an original reason for the Arba Kosas, apart from all the 100 reasons you've all heard at Seder night from your children and grandchildren for the Arba Kosas. He says the Arba Kosas was because all these spiritual degenerative ideas of all these four generations, Enosh, the Mabul, the Migdal Bavel, and Sodom, all four of them came to Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was a combination of all these four disastrous spiritual mistakes, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved us from all four of them. And that's why we have Arba Kosas. So says the Shloh HaKadosh on the Haggadah. So it's interesting that these four different generations represent the four major disasters that took place in the ancient world, and it highlights the uniqueness of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that they are guided by their Tzelem Elokim, by their understanding of Emunah and Chesed, and they are able to avoid all these icebergs. They're able to navigate between the icebergs and not get drawn in to any of these four major mistakes. I don't know if I mentioned to you once, did I tell you about the road sign that I took a picture of? Did I mention that to you? Anybody remember that? No. Okay, so about 20 years ago, so I was in Israel visiting with my children. We went to visit Ein Gedi. You know Ein Gedi? Ein Gedi is on the side of the Yam HaMelach, the Dead Sea. So you go down the road, there's one long road, coastal road along the Yam HaMelach. At a certain point, you turn off it up to Ein Gedi, a beautiful tiyul, highly recommended. Anyhow, when you come out of the parking area and you come back to the road, there's a road sign. And that road sign must be one of the most amazing, if you like, existential road signs in Israel. Because the road sign says as follows: you get to the road and it says, Yerushalayim this way, Sodom this way. That's it. That was your decision. You have to make a decision. Are you going this way to Yerushalayim or that way to Sodom? I stopped the car. The kid asked, why are you stopping the car? I said, look at this road sign. This road sign is a whole drasha. This road sign is the most magnificent road sign I've seen in my life. I took a few pictures of it in my album. Remember picture albums many years ago? We made picture albums. Didn't just have it on your phone. It's in my album, this amazing road sign, Yerushalayim this way, Sodom that way. That's an existential decision that we all have to make regularly in life. And that is, when you go to Ein Gedi, look out for that road sign, which made an impact on me. I'll call upon him. I'd like to have a look now a bit more closely at one of all these four, the most mysterious of them is Migdal Bavel. And this is Bereishit chapter 11, and there's only a few psukim. The whole story is only in a few psukim, and it's not at all clear from the psukim what was the problem. Why was this an issue that they were building the Tower of Babel? What went wrong? So I'd like to have a look at this with you for a moment. Wait a minute. I've got to go into share screen. There we go. Here we go. This. Okay. Can you see the text? Yes. See the text? Excellent. Thank you very much. Migdal Bavel. So let's learn together half a dozen psukim, and then we'll delve into it a bit more in depth. So the pasuk starts off with seemingly a very nice sentence. Vayhi kol haaretz sofa achas udvarim achadim. Everyone on earth spoke the same language, and had Devorim Achodim. So Devorim Achodim is very vague. What does it mean they had the same words? But Devorim doesn't only mean words. Devorim means principles, right? Like the 10 Commandments are referred to in the Torah as Aseres HaDvorim. What do Devorim here mean? So it means a similar ideas. There's a similar, what we would call today maybe a hashkafa, a Weltanschauung, different ways. Mankind was united. When is this? This is after the Mabul, after the flood. Noach and his 3 sons and all their descendants. That was the world population at that time. So it was really one group, one language, and one idea. Rashi gives us 2 very interesting words here. Says Rashi, can you see Rashi here? So Rashi says, Sofa Achas, says Rashi, Loshan HaKodesh. They all only spoke Hebrew. Okay? So that is the tradition that Chazal had, that in the very beginning, Adam or Rishon speaks Hebrew. The early generations, that is the language, that's the original language. That's not in the Torah, incidentally. That's not mafurish in the Torah, but that seems to be an assumption that Chazal made from the way the Torah presents to us the early generations. So they're all speaking one language. Of course, I think most of the people here in this Shia, like myself, had to learn Hebrew and didn't grow up speaking Hebrew. And as you know, there are lots of different types of Hebrew, right? One of my daughters is currently in university, and she says to me, academic Hebrew is a new language. It's not at all the same as conversational Hebrew. I'm here in university having to study a new language completely to understand the lectures and the textbooks in Hebrew. So there are different types of Hebrew, but certainly Hebrew was, according to Chazal, the original language of Safa Achat. Safa is a language. So far, nothing wrong. Okay, continue the next pasuk. Vahi benos on mikedem. They traveled. Vayimtu bika, and they arrived in a valley. Be'eretz Shina vayeshu sham, and they settled there. Still, there isn't really any indication that anybody here is doing anything wrong. Except the Chazal in the Medrash take the phrase benos on mikedem. They traveled away from Kedem. So Kedem can mean the east, but Kedem can also mean their roots, the history. When we say Chadesh Yomeinu Kekedem, we're not talking about going back to the east. We're talking about renew our days like they used to be in original times, right? Chadesh Yomeinu Kekedem. So Kedem can mean Masha Kodem, right? The origins. So Benos Ami Kedem means they traveled away from their origins. The origins being the emunah of Noach and of Shem and of Aver, and they were traveling away from that. So that's a midrashic interpretation, which isn't actually pshat in the pasuk at all. And one could easily learn it differently than simply giving us a direction. But I think maybe Chazal understood that why would it give us the direction here? Whether it's east, south, north, or west is irrelevant to the story. When they say benos mikedem, means they're traveling away, if you like, conceptually from the original way of thinking. Vayomru ishel re'ehu. So here comes an interesting thing. Vayomru ishel re'ehu. What are they saying to each other? They're saying, Hava, let's come together. Nilbana levanim v'nisrafa lisreifa. Let's make bricks and burn them hard. Okay? What is the implication of brick making in this context? So the pasuk continues, "V'tehi lahem haleveino le'even." They started using bricks instead of stone. Now, so long as you build houses out of stone, you're quite seriously limited to the amount you can build. Stones are incredibly heavy. They're not uniform in size, and one can build little houses out of stone. Once you've got bricks, and then it says, and they were able to make some sort of cement. They weren't anymore. Ancient man lived in houses made of stone and clay, which were raw materials. Suddenly they had, and here comes an interesting idea, which is very modern. They suddenly had a new technology which which made them feel that they could build a new world with this new technology. We are masters of the world in a new way, right? And now that we have got bricks, what can we do with bricks? With bricks, we could do something that mankind could never do before. Vayomru, and they said, Vayomru, let's go here to the next pasuk. Vayomru, hava nivne lanu ir. We can now build a city. Okay, a city is all right. Umigdal. And that's why this whole story is called Migdal Bavel, because the Migdal was the skyscraper, right? You've all seen pictures recently of Dubai, right? The skyscrapers of Dubai. Maybe it wasn't quite as big as the skyscrapers of Dubai, but what is the point of the skyscraper of Dubai? The point of it is to show we are masters of the world. We can build anything. We can dominate the world by building the most unbelievable structures. And the skyscraper structure isn't just a convenience, isn't just a modern type of building. It says something about man's, if you like, pride and arrogance of being able to achieve the impossible, right? It's a bit like going to the moon, building a skyscraper. It's the pride that people have got with their own technology. So they had a new technology. We can build a skyscraper. In fact, it's going to be such a big skyscraper, Verosho Bashamai. It's going to be that the top of the skyscraper will be in the heavens. Never before in mankind have we achieved this. And here comes a very interesting phrase about which a lot has been written. V'naseh lanu shem. What does that mean? V'naseh lanu shem. What does it translate here? Right? And we make a name for ourselves. V'naseh lanu shem. Make a name for ourselves. We'll make a name for ourselves. We will become famous. We will become magnificent. We won't just be another generation. We can transform mankind through the use of our technology, and that technology gives us massive physical powers. Pen nafutz al pnei kol ha'aretz. So this is also an interesting thing. Pen nafutz means we don't want to be scattered. We don't want to be scattered around the earth. We're going to build a tower, and that tower is going to be a symbol of our new power. Okay, so far so good. Vayered Hashem liros es ha'ir ves ha'migdal asher bonu b'nei adam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a very strange passage. What does it mean vayered? HaKadosh Baruch Hu came down to see the city and the tower they had built. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't need to go up or to go down or to go sideways in order to see anything. Why doesn't it just say that God saw what they had made, right? And really, honestly, at this point, nothing terrible has been done. Nothing terrible. They've just built a tower. They've become a bit infatuated by their own technology and their own power. What does Vayered mean? So I'm just going to pick up here an interesting line out of the Sforno. So the Sforno says, right, the Sforno, one of the famous Rishonim, the Sforno here says, Vayered Hashem, he says, Loshon HaYerida. If you don't want to follow the Hebrew, you can follow it in the English. Using the word Yerida, liras, what does it mean God came down? Yoma ala Kadosh Baruch Hu, kishayin ha'inyan oz ro'yu la'onesh. It refers to the fact that at that point in time, nothing punishable had happened. Ela mipnei ha'kilkul ha'nimshach elav b'sof ha'inyan. It means HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked at the ultimate consequences of this. Where was this going to? In other words, see, and the Sforno brings an example of a Gemara in Sanhedrin of the Ben Soreh Umorer, the rebellious child, right, who actually hasn't done anything terribly wrong yet, but he has all the signs of becoming a major, a murderer and a thief. Sha'omru, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, Yordo Torah l'sof data. And this is an interesting metaphor in Hebrew. Laredet l'sof data, which means, laredet means to go down, but doesn't literally mean physically in terms of up and down. It means to delve deeper into what are going to be the consequences of this current situation. What is this going to lead to in the future? Laredet lesof data, to actually understand it fully in its deeper meaning. The Gemara uses this a few times. For example, one of the famous authors of the Mishnah, Rav Meir in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says that Rav Meir has this view, but we don't paskin like Rav Meir. And the Gemara says, why don't we paskin like Rav Meir? Shelo yordu chaveirov l'soif dato, means they couldn't. Rav Meir was so profound and had such a deep understanding that his colleagues couldn't completely understand what it is that he wanted. Lo yordu l'soif dato. So here, when it says Vayered Hashem liros of the Migdal Bovel, it means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked at what would be the ultimate consequences of this building. And here comes a reference to this week's Parsha. It's one of the reasons I brought this Sforno, is a reference to Parshas Vayera. The Chain, he says, Inyan Sodom. And the same thing is true in Parshas Vayera with Sodom. Shekosav Bo, when you're reading this week's Parsha, pay attention. It says, Erdonov Ere. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to go down and have a look at Sodom. What does it mean God goes down to have a look at something? It doesn't make any sense at all. It means, as the Sforno says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked at Sodom and saw that from Sodom would emerge necessarily, there'd be a necessarily consequence of a totally disastrous culture, a totally disastrous end product. And that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu davens to him and says, well, maybe there are 50 tzaddikim, maybe there are 40 tzaddikim, maybe even 10 tzaddikim, and the implication is maybe those tzaddikim can change. How do you know that it's a necessary consequence? Maybe they can do tshuva. They can only do tshuva if they have within them a certain amount of people who are engaging in trying to re-educate them, right? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, I'm going to destroy them because there isn't anybody who has that power to really change the direction in which they're going. But what's interesting here is, what's the connection here is the word laredet, right? That God came down refers to a situation where God looks at the final outcome. Incidentally, these English translations are mine, and they're just a synopsis. They're not a verbatim translation. God looks at the final outcome, even though the present situation is not too bad, it will definitely result in a disaster, similarly with Sodom. Okay. So next pasuk, Vayoma Hashem, Hein Am Echad. Here they are. They are united as one people. Don't forget, we're talking about the whole of mankind at this moment. It's after the flood. This is the sum total of human beings which are alive at the moment. They are one people, the Sofa Achas Lekulam, and they are all speaking the same language. V'zeh hachilam lasos. And look what they have started to do. Look what they have started to do with their unity and with their shared language and culture. What are they doing? They're engaging in greater power and technology, and they're becoming, and that's the direction they're going in. Va'ata, and now lo yibotze mehem kol asher yozmu lasos. They will come to think, have a look out, that nothing they can propose be out of their reach. Lo yibotze, nothing will be prevented from them. What's the pasuk here describing? It's describing their mentality, the mentality of human beings. We saw this recently in our culture. I don't know if any of you have ever seen, I don't know if I've mentioned it before in this shir, I'll just mention it again if I have. Some of you might have seen in the last 10 years a couple of books written by someone called Harari, Yuval Noah Harari. Anybody seen these books lying around? I'm not giving them as recommended reading for this shir because they are really classic modern apikorsis. But who is this Yuval Noah Harari? He's an Israeli academic who has published books about the history of mankind and the future of mankind. So the first book is called Homo Sapiens, and it's a sort of a potted version of the whole of the development of mankind over the years. And the second book, listen to this, is called Homo Deus, which means man has become godlike, right? we, mankind, and basically when I read it, I thought Migdal Bavel, right? What he was saying is he is intoxicated by modern technology. We, mankind, we have come to realize that all religions and beliefs in God is all myth. It's all something which is being concocted by some people. The reality is the physical reality. Human beings really have got no free choice at all, according to Mr. Harari. The new human beings are simply algorithms, complicated algorithms. The minute we work out the algorithm of the human being, we can predict anything and everything you will do for the rest of your life. There's nothing about free will is a myth, right? For Professor Harari, free will is a myth. And really, we're in the process of developing artificial intelligence, which ultimately will make mankind obsolete, because artificial intelligence will be able to do everything man can do, only better. And therefore we have reached a divine proportions. And this was really a modern version of Migdal Bavel, of what is being said here in these psukim, that basically the pasuk says, here we are, guess what? We've got bricks and cement. We can now build skyscrapers. There's nothing we can't do. We are going to build Naselanu Shem. We are going to become famous, and we are going to make ourselves into the most prominent people in this world. To which HaKadosh Baruch Hu answers, Hava nerda v'nivlo sham sfosam ashal yishmu ish sfas re'ehu. What I'm going to do is I'm going to confuse their speech, that they will not understand each other. And this was the origin of all the different languages in the world. By Yofetz Hashem osam misham al pnei kol haaretz, HaKadosh Baruch Hu scatters them around the world, and they stopped building the city, and they Al-Kain Korashama Bovel. So the pasuk here says the word Bovel comes from the word Bolal. Tishon Bolal. Bolal means in Lashon HaKodesh, Bolal means a mixture. When you stir something and you mix it together, that's a belilo. That is a mixture of different elements, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu Bolal as Sfas Haaretz or Misham Hefitza. So what's wrong here? What have they done here? Okay, they've got technology. Okay, they're a bit proud of their technology. But what is the terrible disaster here? So here, first of all, it's interesting to see the Kliyaka. I haven't translated it. I'll just do one or two lines here. The Kliyaka says, in order to understand this, you have to look at a Mishnah in Sanhedrin, where the Mishnah says an interesting thing. I've underlined it here. Can you see this? The Mishnah says, in Sanhedrin Ayin Aleph, Kinus l'Rishayim. Once Rishayim unite together in one group, Ra lahem v'ra la'olam. It's bad for them because each one only encourages the other. V'ra la'olam, and it's bad for the world because then they join together as a negative force. What is good for Rishayim? So he says pizur. Pizur is the opposite of kinus, right? Pizur means to be scattered, and kinus means to be united. It says pizur l'Rishayim. Tov lahem, right? For tov la'olam. If Rishayim are scattered, that is good for them and good for the world. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw that since the kavana of mankind at that time was not a kavana of emunah and of chesed, right? It was for pride, power, technology, and domination. Therefore, if they're united all together, this will only reach such proportions that there'll be no hope for any single individual in mankind to achieve any spiritual achievements at all, right? But this Mishnah is an interesting one, right? One of the ways that Kadosh Baruch Hu has to deal with Rishayim in this world is disunity. One of the greatest illustrations in our life, incidentally, of this principle, of this Mishnah, is if you look at the map of the land of Israel, surrounded by 20-odd countries, all of whom wish Israel weren't there, the greatest saving feature that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has put into this world is that they all hate each other. They all hate each other, right? All these countries distrust each other, right? And therefore, imagine all these 20 odd countries surrounding Israel were united together in one group, and they loved each other, and they worked together in one. It would be a disaster for Eretz Yisrael and for Medinas Yisrael, right? The great achievement, the great chesed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done with us is that the Lebanese and the Syrians, the Jordanians and the Iraqis and the Egyptians and the Yemenites, they all can't bear each other. Not to mention the Iranians and the Iraqis, they've all got such deep divisions among themselves that's what saves us. It's only because of that Israel manages to survive, surrounded by all these hostile countries. And this is the principle of that Mishnah in Sanhedrin Ayin Aleph, that one of HaKadosh Baruch Hu introduced into the world the principle of Pizur l'Rishayim, that people who are Rishayim, who have destructive intent, HaKadosh Baruch Hu deals with that with the Migdal Bavel principle. Let's scatter them with each other. Let's divide. Let's introduce into their mind that there are Shiites against Sunnis. I've looked into this Shiite against Sunnis machlekes they've got. It doesn't make sense at all. It's the most unbelievable, incomprehensible machlekes they've got going back hundreds of years, but they're willing to massacre each other over the Sunni Shiite machlekes is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Klal Yisrael. There's no question in my mind, right? And one of the main reasons that there are some countries now who are now trying to make peace with Israel is only because they are Sunni countries and they're dead scared of the Shiite Iranians, and they're afraid that the Iranians are going to kill them, and therefore they need to strengthen themselves by uniting with Israel that they perceive as the strongest military power. But it's all because of their fear of each other. If they weren't afraid of each other, it would be a disaster. This principle is the principle of Migdal Bavel, to separate the countries who are Rishayim, who have destructive intentions, to separate them from each other, and in that way to give a chance. So the Sforno says that this whole story of Migdal Bavel was a necessary, listen to this, a very interesting point, was a necessary precondition for Avram to do what he did. In other words, Avram was able to oppose the pagan culture and teach Emunah only because all the different nations and countries opposed each other, had a different views. But imagine the whole of mankind were united in one view of paganism, right? Against Avraham Avinu, he wouldn't have been able to do anything at all. But like this, he was able to say to them, look, the Hittites are different to the Canaanim, and the Canaanim are different to the to different groups, and each one has their own nonsense. I've got my Torah of Emunah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he was able to teach Emunah. So Migdal Bavel becomes a very important precondition, right? And that's why Migdal Bavel is the last parsha in Parshas Noach, before we have Avraham in Parshas Lech Lecha. Right? Okay, I'm not going to go into the Abarbanel here. I can see I brought you the Abarbanel, the Hamek Dova. Okay, so Hamek Dova, the Netziv, is writing at a time when communism was growing in Russia, and basically what he says, the Netziv was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva in the late 1800s, and he says basically Migdal Bavel is an exact expression of communism. Is the atheism of communism, the worship of technology of communism, and the idea that communism, the thought police. In other words, Chazal say that part of the Migdal Bavel was that they didn't permit any different ways of thinking. Everybody has to believe it's a type of a fascism. Communism and fascism have a lot in common. Both of them are systems of thought which don't permit anybody to have their own independent minds, independent thinking. You have to conform to the belief of the fascist leader or of the communist leader. Anybody who deviates from it gets destroyed. What is the first appearance of this type of society was Migdal Bavel. Anybody who disagreed with them and said, no, we're not going to build a Migdal, we'll build something else, or we won't live in this city, we'll live somewhere else, was killed. That's what Chazal say. that there was a uniformity. This was the origin of Nimrod, incidentally. The king Nimrod was the king of Migdal Bavel, and he was the absolute dictator at that time and didn't allow for any other individual thinking, and this therefore was the introduction to Avram Avinu. What I'd like to do now in the last 10, 15 minutes of the Shia, I'd like to have a look at the next story and one particular phrase which is picked up by the Gemara, and look at how immediately after Migdal Bavel, Avram Avinu appears on the scene. So these are famous psukim, which I think everybody's familiar with. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avram Avinu, Lech lecha, me'atzcha, me'ladcha, be'savicha, lo teshareka, that Avram has to go and leave Ur-Kasdim and leave Choron and come to the land of Israel. And if you come to the land of Israel, I promise you that you will only flourish here, become a great nation. Right? And those who bless you will be blessed, etc. Those who curse you will be cursed. And then, incidentally, Avram is given one, not incidentally at all, one of the most important, what one could say is the job description of the Jewish people throughout history. Because don't forget, these are the foundational psukim of the Jewish people. Avram Avinu's initial contact with God and the instructions given to Avram Avinu, they are, if you like, the constitution, right? Like the constitution of the United States. I think today, particularly, we have to endorse God Help America today to get a leader who will point them in the right direction. I think America needs a lot of siyata dishmaya today, and part of my thoughts and prayers are that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives them a leader. Not that the choice is very inspiring, I must be honest with you, the choice between two different, very strange people, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give them a leader which points them in the right direction. But here, lahavdil elef havdalas, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appoints Avraham Avinu as the founder of Klal Yisrael, and he tells him, you should know, what is your job description? Your job description is the nivrachu v'cha kol mishpachos adam, which means you should be the carrier of a bracha to mankind. Through you, Avraham Avinu, God is going to give a bracha to mankind. It's very interesting, it's a very profound idea. If the first profound idea of the Torah is the Tzelem Elokim, the second profound idea of the Torah is that that the job description of Klal Yisrael is to be carriers of bracha. How does that bracha express itself? In all sorts of different ways, right? The primary way is emunah, a belief in God. The second is a belief in chesed. And the third is all the moral code of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. That was the original bracha that Avraham Avinu was teaching, to be a blessing for mankind, not to be involved in building skyscrapers, not to be involved in the power of technology, but to be involved in transmitting brachas to other people. And that was his job description. What's interesting is, I'd like to just have a look, because time is a little bit short. When Avram sets out the land of Israel, who does he take with him? Vayikach Avram. Avram takes, he's not yet Avraham, he's still Avram. Vayikach Avram as Sarai Ishto. He takes his wife, of course, and he takes, interestingly, as Lot ben Achiv. He takes his nephew. He has no children yet. Avraham Avinu is only 75 years old. His first child is born when he's 100. That's not quite true. Yishmael was born 13 years earlier. But Yitzchak is only born when he's 100. He takes with him Lot ben Achiv. He takes his nephew Lot, the Eskol Rechushim Asher Chashu, and all their possessions. And here comes the phrase that I want to look at in the last few minutes of the Shia: V'es hanefesh asher osu b'chara. Right. So the translator here says the people that they had acquired in Choron. But what does the Hebrew phrase here mean? It means nefesh means the people. Asher osu, they had made people in Choron. So what could that possibly mean? Ves hanefesh asher osu b'Choron. that they take with them his family and his possessions and his nephew. Okay, that's fine. And now he's taking with the people that he had made. What sense can we make out of that? So Rashi immediately gives us a synopsis of Chazal on this. What does it mean, Asher Asu B'choron? The people Asher Shehichnison Tachas Kanfei Hashchina. The disciples of Avram and Sarah, who he had succeeded in teaching them Emunah and Chesed, in the metaphor of Chazal, that he had brought them under the Kanfei Hashchina, to live under the protection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says Rashi, Avram Megayes HaAnashim, Avram was teaching the men, the Sarah Megayeres HaNashim, and Sarah was teaching the women. In other words, they had a team. Avram and Sarah, between them, they were giving classes in Emunah, in Chesed, in the moral code of the Noachide laws, and all this. And says Rashi continues, Uma'ale alehem hakosov, and the Torah regards it for them ki'ilu asa'u, as if they had made them. So what does that mean? That means these were people. Here was Avram and Sarah, and it's a very profound idea here. Avram and Sarah have no biological children who they have physically made, so to speak, by giving birth to them, but they have spiritual children. They have spiritual children they have made. Who are they? They are the disciples who have accepted from them a new way of life, of emunah and chesed. And they are the people that they have made, right? And that's why, incidentally, Avram is always considered to be the father of all Gerim, and converts are all B'nai Avram Avinu, because they are not the biological children, but they are the spiritual. Avram has spiritual children long before he has physical children. And this is a very interesting principle. There have, in fact, been many Jewish leaders throughout history who've had no biological children, right? So the late Lubavitcher Rebbe had no biological children. The Chazon Ish had no biological children, right? There are quite a few great leaders who had no biological children, but they had many hundreds of thousands of spiritual children, of disciples, of followers, people they had inspired and taught. And these are considered to be Hanefesh Asher Asu B'char. And now I'd just like to share with you, finally, one piece of Gemara in Avodah Zarah that does something very interesting with this pasuk. So the Gemara says as follows, Tana Debei Eliyahu. And this phrase, actually, Tana Debei Eliyahu, is a subject of some discussion, what actually it means, because we don't know of any Tanaim who were called Eliyahu. We're not aware of any. We're Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tafan and Hillel and Shammai, but we don't have anybody called Eliyahu. And yet the Gemara occasionally refers to Tana Debei Eliyahu. It was taught in the house of Eliyahu, and many of the Rishonim say that this is a reference to Eliyahu Hanavi, that there was a certain type of mystical communication between great tzaddikim and Eliyahu Hanavi. And indeed, a lot of the writings of the Zohar and the Arizal are attributed to Eliyahu Hanavi. Exactly what that means and how that works, I'm afraid I'm not privy to that, not being a Kabbalist and not being on that madrega, but there are individuals who have certain communication through Eliyahu Hanavi. They come to know certain things. So have a look at this. Tana Debei Eliyahu, says the Gemara, Sheishes alofim shana have ha'olam. The world will exist for 6,000 years, counting from Adam and Eve, right? We are now in 5781. So the world will exist for 6,000 years. And these 6,000 years are divided up into three categories. Shnei alofim toihu. The first 2,000 years are toihu. What does toihu mean? So he translates here, for 2,000 years, the world was waste. Toihu means toihu vavohu, means completely, from a spiritual point of view, it had no direction at all. And then it was Shnei Alofim Torah. The next 2,000 years were 2,000 years of Torah, which we're going to look at in a moment. And then the last 2,000 years that we are in at the moment, Shnei Alofim Yemosa Mashiach, the last set of 2,000 years, right? The last 2,000 years are preparing for Mashiach. And sadly, he hasn't come yet. That is a reference made in the Gemara written 1,500 years ago, you understand. So the Gemara there says, we're waiting for Yemos HaMashiach, but he hasn't come yet. But the last 2,000 years are a process preparing for Yemos. What does it mean, 2,000? So the Gemara wants to know something particularly interesting. What happened? Here comes the key question of this Gemara. What happened in the year 2000 that the world, spiritually speaking, was no longer tohu, was no longer a mess, a wasteland, and it started laying the foundations for 2,000 years of Torah? How does that work? So the Gemara asks, Shnei alofim Torah me'emas, how are you counting 2,000 years of Torah? So basically, it's saying here, if we say it starts from Matan Torah, that doesn't work. Because Matan Torah, when you examine the calculations, evident that from the creation of the world to Matan Torah, so as I've written here, the Torah was given in the year 2448, counting from Adam and Eve, right? It wasn't given in the year 2000. So what happened in the year 2000? Here's an interesting thing. Something happened 448 years before Matan Torah, which Tano de Be'elio is telling us was the beginning, was like the Kita Aleph of Matan Torah. Matan Torah was the graduation, if you like, was the end of the process, the climax of the whole process. But the process began in the year 2000. Says the Gemara, and this is a very beautiful piece of Gemara. The Elo, says the Gemara, Mive'es hanefesh asher asu b'chora. The pasuk in the beginning of Lech Lecha, that Avram and Sarah were teaching emunah and chesed and morality to mankind, that was the beginning of a new world. The first 2,000 of years was a wasteland. In other words, there were some individuals who maintained their Tzelem Elokim, but the vast majority went down the drain, either in Dara Enosh, Dara Mabul, the Migdal Bovel, or Sodom. But Avram Avinu started as hanefesh asher asu b'chora. Says the Gemara ugemiri. Gemiri comes from the word Gemara. We have a tradition. Gemiri means we have a tradition. That Avram b'hahi shaita b'chamishim b'tatiha. Avram was 52 years old when he did that. So Avraham Avinu is born in the year 1948 after the creation of the world. So when he's 52 years old is the year 2000. When the year 2000, when the clock ticked 2,000 years after the creation of Adam and Chava, at that point, Avram opened up his yeshiva. Avram and Sarah opened up their yeshiva and their seminary, and they started teaching anyone who was interested to come and hear something different and something interesting. They started making Balei Tshuva. They started making Geirim. They started teaching the new teaching. At that point, says the Gemara, very fascinating. At that point, the world was no longer tohu vavohu. And this is very fascinating. And this has a bearing on quite a few issues in Sefer Bereishit. One of the issues is, for example, one might ask the question in these parshas, what was so unique about Avraham Avinu? He believed in God, and God spoke to him. Okay, that was true about Noach. It was true about Shem. It was true about Chanoch. There were other individuals. Adam Arishon believed in God, and God spoke to him. What was so unique about Avraham Avinu? Why is Avram the founding father of Klal Yisrael? Why is that? So this Gemara in Avodah Zarah Daf Tes Amud Aleph tells us, in the name of Eliyahu Hanavi, tells us the answer. The answer is that he started having followers and disciples and people who understood from him a new way of life. The minute he starts teaching, that's the beginning of the 2,000 years of Torah. That is the beginning of the new world, which is being guided by the Tzelem Elokim, which has avoided Enosh and Migdal Bavel and Sodom and the Mabul, all those different spiritually disastrous generations had really swallowed up the vast majority of the world, but Avram is able to teach something different. And at that point, the world has a new beginning. But it's interesting to see how, in actual fact, the Migdal Bovel expresses this idea of people who started to worship human power, worshiping the state, right? In communism, the worship of the state, and in fascism, the worship of the power of the state. Na'aseh lanu shem. We are a group of people. We don't need God. We don't need anything spiritual. We are a group of people, and together with the brotherhood of mankind, right? Karl Marx's idea of the brotherhood of mankind, we can bring a redemption to the world without God. We don't need God. We can do it just through the power of conformity to our ideas of communism and fascism. And we all know what happened to all those systems, only ended up in the slaughter of tens of millions of people. And this was all Migdal Bovel. This was all Migdal Bovel. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. I'd like to thank you all coming together to learn some Torah. I always enjoy learning with this group.
Can't hear.
Can't hear, Rabbi.
Can't hear.
Can't hear.
No,
Thank you so
can't
much.
hear you.
Okay, and now you can hear me. Right now
Yes.
you can hear me.
Okay.
See, Eli Friedwald, Eli Friedwald is in the driving seat. He decides who can speak and who can't speak. But I think you will find that each of you can unmute yourselves if you wish to. And I'm happy to see you all, and look after yourselves. Keep
Thank
safe.
you very much, Rabbi
healthy.
Kimche.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you next week, please God.
Rabbi,
I
thank
hope
you.
you enjoy. Oh, Danny Woolick, nice to see you, Danny. Nice to see you. And other people who've joined us along the way. It's these themes.